Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Azure Administrator Study Series. I hope you guys had a wonderful day and also having a wonderful week. So I know it's been a long time since you see our faces, and we do apologize for the time that it has taken, but it's definitely worth it. So today we do have a lot in store for you. So thank you for joining us. Sir David, how are you doing?
Yeah, it's good, man. It's good. It's good to be back finally to
Yeah.
have some time to do this. But but one of the things I was thinking about was so I was speaking with someone like over this last weekend, right? And they were concerned about like a few things that they had to deal with. And one of the suggestions I gave to them, I was like, listen, you have to look after yourself. Right. It's like you've
That's
got to
correct.
look after yourself because the people that you're trying to look after, if you break down,
That's
then
right.
you won't be able to look after them.
That's
So make
right.
sure you look after yourself. Then after I finished, I was like, I should probably follow my own advice. Right? I should probably. So that's one of the things is that Sakofi and myself, we've been
Yeah.
taking some time to back off. It's been really busy at work. Things have been a
Yeah.
bit busy for us. So we've just been trying to recover a little bit, get some other things done. But it's good to be back. It's very, very good to be back.
Yeah, it's definitely good to be
Yeah.
back. So, what do you have in store for us today, Sir David?
Yeah, so we're going to continue with our live study series on the Azure Solutions Architect, right? So we're going to continue with that series, and we're going to be looking at the compute aspect, which is what we were meant to start the last time.
Yeah.
So we're going to carry on with that aspect. But before I do that, let me go ahead and share my screen. So one of the things that's been keeping at least me away. So I know that Sakofi has been busy with other things. He's been busy with investment.
Yeah.
I hear that Bitcoin is going up crazily now
Well,
again.
well, it is. Yeah. So that's what we keep saying. Buy the dip. Buy the dip. So it's gonna go up.
Well, some of us ran out of money to buy the deep
I
sacrifice.
know.
So
We'll keep
only
going. It will keep dipping.
you buy the dip and it keeps dipping. Exactly. So that's the sort of like the thing. So yeah, so this is one of the things that has been keeping me busy on my hands. I've been trying to get through the last chapters of this book. So finally, the last chapters have gone to technical editor. So I have two new books that are out. So Microsoft
Hooray!
Azure, yeah, it's an exciting one.
Wow!
So I have the Microsoft.
Congratulations. This is
Oh.
definitely a very big achievement to write two books within a year. Wow! Amazing.
Yeah, it's been busy. I've been having less sleep. So this is one of the reasons why. So the first one is on Microsoft Azure Security Technology. So looking at the Azure Security Engineer certification, but also looking at it from a practical perspective. So looking at things from a very practical perspective. So focusing on areas like host security, container security, network security, perimeter security, and many other aspects that I really delved into and I really broke those aspects down. So in that. So then the other one which just got announced is this. So this is penetration testing for penetration Azure for ethical hackers. So this is one of the topics that you do not see, you hardly see anything about it out, in the community. You hardly see anyone really tackle this subject. So
Right. Yeah.
my co-author, Carl Fossine, so he heads a security research team in a company called NetSpy in Oregon. So Carl and myself, we sort of like been, releasing different articles and blogs around this topic for a long time. So it was sort of like, I was seeing what Carl was doing on the side. Carl was
Yeah.
seeing what I was doing on the side. So somehow we ended up in the same Slack channel one time in the community. And it was sort of like, oh, I see what you're doing. And it was, oh, yeah, I see what you're doing.
Wow.
So then, we started seeing each other's work. Carl referenced one of my work in a blog that I wrote, one of the demos that I did on pen testing Azure. I've seen amazing work that he did on enumerating identities in Azure. I invited him to speak at the Azure Security User Group, and we just connected, and essentially we end up writing a book on all the different things that we've learned about pen testing Azure in our different experiences. So that's what this other book is about.
Oh, that's amazing. I can't wait to read these two books. Definitely amazing. Uh, can we share the links as well in the chat?
Yeah, so let me go ahead and put both in the chat window. So let's go ahead and do that now. and yeah, so it's available right now for pre-order. So uh, that's those are they are definitely good books. And one of the things that I should mention also is that they're both hands-on. So like the pen test Azure, we're actually going to walk you through hands-on scenarios where you're going to set up vulnerable environments in Azure, and you're going to test. You're going to do different tests on that. Okay, so Sakofi, what are we going to be doing today? Let's see what we're going to be doing today. So let me bring up
Absolutely.
Paint. And we're going to be looking at the objective for the Azure Solutions Architect Certification Study on designing compute or designing IaaS compute solutions. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to be looking at the objective. So actually, I'll probably start doing that, objective for today. That's what we're going to be looking at. So we're going to be looking at different aspects of IaaS compute solutions. We're going to be looking at um, aspect of scalability, aspect of security, aspect of compliance. We're going to look at different architectural aspects when it comes to this. So, anyways, we're doing an Azure Solutions Architect Live Study Series. So, what I'm going to start with today is I'm going to start by asking our audience a few questions. So, these questions are going to help you locate sort of like your own knowledge when it comes to this particular objective. So, we're going to start with some questions, and then we're going to go into the conversation. So here's some questions for you today, audience. So question number one for you to help you test your knowledge, right? So we're here to increase our knowledge, all of us together. You plan to run an image rendering workload in Azure. The workload uses parallel compute processes. What is the best service to use to run the workload? So you have options A, B, C, and D. So virtual machine skill set, function app, Kubernetes service, batch. You're meant to select what you think is the best option to handle the type of workload that's been described. So if you put your answer in the chat window, and let's see. So go ahead with the question again if you need to, and let's know what what's.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. It said select the best answer, right?
Yeah. And this is the side of top sort of questions that if you're planning to take the solutions architects, especially the AZ304, these are the sort of questions that you have to be ready for. So in some cases, they're going to give you an option, a question that's going to have more than one answer, and you're meant to look at the requirements that they've mentioned and select what you think is the best, what you think is the best answer. So audience, option A, B, C, or D, let's know what you think. So let me set that to about 1 minute timer. So it's already past 1 minute for now. Okay, so I can't see any answer in the chat window, so I'll just go ahead and review what the answer is. So the answer to this, ladies and gentlemen, is, here we go. It's Azure Batch Service.
Wow, that's interesting. I was thinking about the Azure Function app.
Yeah. So the reason for this is to quickly bring that up, and I'm go ahead and we're going to talk a little bit about that later.
Right.
So, but the reason for this is that it says workload is going to use parallel compute processes, and also you're looking to do an image rendering workload, which typically that's going to require some type of batch process in terms of what you're doing. So the Azure Batch Service allows us to say, here is a task that I need to complete, right? And what I want to do is I want to schedule that task to run across parallel CPUs, right? So I have maybe about 1,000 CPUs here, right? And I can say, let's dismiss that. So I have 1,000 CPUs. And I say, here is a task, there's a bunch of tasks that I want to run. I'm going to run them in parallel across the CPUs, and I'm going to output them into something like Azure Storage in the end, right? So the advantage of this is that something that could probably take, 15 days to complete, because I'm scheduling them in parallel to run across multiple compute, will probably take about an hour to complete, right? So that's one of the advantages. So let's go to about 2 more questions, and then we're going to get into the topic for today. So this will help you to sort of like locate your understanding of the services. So here's another question for you. So read this one carefully. You have 1 minute to answer this. You are designing a microservices architecture that will support a web application. The solution must meet the following requirements. So you're an architect, so pay attention to this requirement. Allow independent upgrades to each microservice. Deploy the solution on premises and to Azure. Set policies for performing automatic repairs to the microservices. Support low latency and hyperscale operations. You need to recommend a technology. So you have 4 options A, B, C, and D. What do you think is the right answer? So you have about 56 seconds. So read through the requirement. These are the types of questions that you're going to get if you're doing the exam also. So you have to be able to quickly process the requirement and select what you think is the right option and move on to the next question. So Sakofi, did you get like the Bitcoin during the? Someone said it's not clear.
Well, you know how it is, right? I was just being a human. When it was time for me to buy the dips, I was panicking and I sold. So
Oh
I
no!
lost.
Oh no!
You know how it goes, right? It's easy to say it. It's easier said than done, right?
Okay, hold on. Someone said the picture is not clear. Really? Is the picture really not clear? Do we
Yeah,
have like?
probably check the settings on your YouTube because I have it here and it seems to be very clear.
Oh,
So
okay.
probably change your settings if you're running on YouTube. Check to ensure that you're running on maybe 720p or 1080p.
Yeah. So yeah, if you check that Sunday and let us know. Okay. So I can see we have a few answers. So we have Manu says first, which is Azure
So
Container Instance.
containers.
I can see Tunde says, sorry, I can see Okoyemi says Azure Logic App. So let's look at what the answer is. So let's look at the requirement first, and then let's see how we arrive at an answer here. So if you look at the requirement, you're going to be implementing something in a microservices architecture. So when you're implementing something in a microservices architecture in Azure, you're typically talking about container services or you're talking about functions, right? Either container services or Azure functions.
That's right.
So, and if you're implementing something, so it says allow independent upgrades to each microservice. Then look at this second requirement, deploy the solution on premises and to Azure. Which of these Azure services allows you to deploy both on premises and to Azure? So first of all, that rules out these two and this just for that requirement alone. So that really leaves us with one. So service fabric, it's sort of like similar to like what Kubernetes service is, right? It's a container orchestrator. We can deploy it on premises or we can deploy it as a managed service in Azure. It allows us to run containers that are typically aligned with the Microsoft type workloads like .NET type applications. And it provides container orchestration capabilities. So that's what that provides. So the answer to this, ladies and gentlemen, is Azure Service Fabric. So don't be upset with yourself if you did not get any of those questions correctly. I have more questions that I'm going to be giving to you. So, however, this is just to help us just see where we are in terms of our knowledge, and then we can look to improve things before we go for the exam. So when we talk about compute services in Azure, Sir Kofi, services that we can use to host and run applications and services in Azure, they fall typically into 3 main categories. We have infrastructure as a service compute options, right? So these options typically give us more control of the underlying operating system, right? So for example, I can deploy a virtual machine in Azure. I can deploy something called a virtual machine scale set, which allows me to automate the scaling of identical virtual machines. I can deploy something called a virtual desktop. So virtual desktop is not mainly for application hosting. It's something for hosting an environment for users to work with, sort of like remote desktop style service. We have something called the dedicated host in Azure. So where you can have physical compute that's dedicated to your organization and isolated from the other Azure customers. So if you have security or compliance requirement that requires you to have isolated hardware, you can use that service. For example, we have Azure Batch, like we saw earlier. Azure Batch allows us to be able to run tasks across parallel compute, sort of like high performance compute scenario. So all of these options will fall under the category of infrastructure as a service compute options in Azure. So again, the distinctive capability of the services is they give us more control to the underlying operating system, right, of this. Then we have compute options that you classify as platform options, or platform service options, right? So platform service options, let's look at what some of those options are. So we have options like Azure App Service. So the thing about these options is typically they have the underlying operating system managed for us, right? So they manage the underlying operating system so that we have less responsibilities as developers, as administrators, as architects. We have less responsibilities to take care of. So services like App Service Environment, which allows us to host web applications, API applications on an environment that's managed by Microsoft or by the Azure platform. We have a new service called Static Web Apps, which allows us to host, the types of front-end web applications. So things like your applications written with Vue, written with React, right? With Blazor, with all these different frameworks, and you can host them on this service. We have a service like Azure Function App, which allows us to run microservices as code or as containers. We have services like Spring Cloud. We have services like Quantum. So these have like underlying managed environment. And then finally, we have container services that we can use to run, host compute on Azure. So container services like container instances, which is just a managed Docker virtual machine in Azure. So again, it manages the underlying operating system, manages the underlying Docker container engine. All we just need to do is focus on deploying containers. We have services like Kubernetes Service and Service Fabric that provide orchestration capabilities, right, that we can use to deploy our container microservices and have that orchestrated with capabilities of Kubernetes or Service Fabric. So here are the different compute services that we have in Azure. So this is not a holistic list. This just gives you like a general list of these types of compute, the types of compute services that exist in Azure. So, Kofi, look at this one. This one is an interesting one, right? Quantum.
Yeah, that's. I bet that's a supercomputer or something like that, right?
So it's sort of like, and there was a big argument on this one recently. I'm not sure if you saw that argument where I can't remember whether it was IBM or someone that came out and said, "Oh, we have quantum computing in our cloud," and then like Microsoft scientists wrote their own blog to say, "No, that's not true. Quantum computing. You're just." Yeah, it was very funny. I'm not sure. Did you see that blog?
No, I did not. No.
Let's see. It was a very, very interesting news. Let me see. It was a very, very. Oh, okay. Yeah, there it is. Let me bring it up. That was in year 20. That was just last year.
All right.
Yeah, that was just like, let me bring up the blog. It's a very, very interesting one. So, anyways, Microsoft has a service that you can use to start playing around with quantum capabilities in Azure. So that's what that service is about. And it supports multiple quantum frameworks. So this is from IBM, on quantum supremacy. And this is IBM people writing. And essentially they were just this essentially just tackling Google and saying Google published a paper to say, hey, we have this one. They were like, hey, let's first of all understand what quantum is. So it's so funny, right? So, but anyways, so Azure has a capability called Quantum also, so you can essentially use to implement. So I was playing around with this the other day. Let me bring up my Azure portal very quickly. So let me bring up the Azure portal. So I was playing around with this. So it actually supports like multiple, again, quantum frameworks, not just the one provided by Microsoft. So if I look for
So what
quantum,
are the sort of frameworks then? I mean, it
so
support.
there's lots of them. So
Oh,
actually, like
okay.
when I was creating that, because it allowed me, but then it was sort of like the money, the providers. Yeah, anyway. So yeah, you have the providers. So the one from Microsoft was the one that I was like, yeah, you know what? So, but then you can add other providers like Honeywell, Quantum Solutions, IonQ, iCloud optimization platform. So you can choose different providers in terms of the workload, what your workload is going to run on. But essentially, what this helps people to do is that you can begin to test quantum capabilities in terms of your applications or your services, before they become mainstream. So, anyways, let's move on to the other aspects of this. So, let's go back. So, in terms of how do we select the option to host our applications, there are multiple criteria that we have to look at, Sakofi, multiple criteria that we have to consider when we say which option should we go for. So let's start at the beginning. So let's go for start. So one of the options that we have to start with is, are we building a new application or are we migrating an existing application? Because that can inform the options that we have to use in terms of the hosting option for our application. So whether we are building a new one or whether we are migrating an existing one. So let's follow the path and say we are building a new application. One of the first consideration that we have to check is, do we need control of the underlying operating system? That's very important, right? So, for example, Sarkov is building. Yeah,
We're
that's
good
true,
fun.
James. So, for example, Sarkov is building. You're building a new application. Maybe your application requires you to make changes to some system files before your application can work. Right? For you to be able to do that, you need control of the underlying operating system. So that's something important for you to consider. Right? So if that's the case, then you go for virtual machines. Virtual machines gives you control of the operating system. If you do not need control of the underlying operating system, the workload that you're running is a high performance compute workload. Are you looking to run a batch process where you're going to schedule a task to run across parallel CPUs? If that's what you're looking to do, then Azure Batch is probably the service for you. If your workload is not high performance compute, are you implementing your workload that's going to use a microservice architecture, or is it going to use a monolithic architecture? A microservice architecture is one where you've decoupled the components of your applications into smaller pieces, right? And that gives you flexibility because you can upgrade the pieces individually, right? For
Yeah.
to each other, right? So essentially, like you've probably seen like those kind of things, like where you have like some of this furniture, or some of this, even like when we have things like laptops, for example, right? So you have like the hard drive is decoupled really from the computer for many systems. So what that means is that you can upgrade the hard drive without having to replace the entire computer, right? And that gives you more flexibility than if you have a computer where it's all bonded together, right? If you need to touch anything, you touch everything, right? That's not the best. So microservices architecture, because they are decoupled, allows us more flexibility in how we deploy, how we roll out our application, and how quickly we can evolve our applications, right? If every time I'm touching an application, Sarkofi, I have to be concerned that I could affect everything, that's going to give me a pause, right? I'm going to be like, okay, I've got to be careful. But if I know that anytime I'm touching this, I'm only touching one tiny bit of the application, that allows me to be able to evolve much more quicker. So if it's a microservices architecture and if it's not a microservice architecture and it's a web application or API application, you probably want to use Azure App Service. If it is using microservice architecture and it's event driven, so in other words, you want the solution to respond to different events that's taking place. So you can look to use a service like Azure Functions. If it's not event driven and it's microservices architecture, then you need to consider, are you going to be hosting it as containers? And if you're going to be hosting that as containers, does it need orchestration capabilities? Do you need to be able to get this solution to work with other solutions in tandem, right? If you do not need orchestration capabilities, then you can probably use something like container instance because it doesn't have orchestration capabilities. It's just a simple, managed Docker virtual machine. If you need orchestration capabilities, is it using the Microsoft technology stack like .NET? We looked at Service Fabric earlier, right?
Yeah.
So if you're choosing the Microsoft stack like .NET and it needs orchestrator capabilities, you probably want to look at Service Fabric, right? Because Service Fabric is much more matured when it comes to the Microsoft technology stack and when it comes to containerization. But if it's not using the Microsoft technology stack, running as containers and needs orchestration capabilities, then you can look at Kubernetes service. So you can see that there's a lot of work that we are doing as architects at Kofi.
That's right.
You have to really look at the different requirements, and then based on the requirements, then you have to sort of like go for the option that really helps you to meet the requirement that you're going for. However, if it's a migration of an existing application, then what amount of work are you looking to do? Are you looking to put in the work to actually redesign your application to fit the services in the cloud? Right. So, for example, the example that I gave earlier, Sakofi, where I said, if I need to modify some system files before my application can run successfully, am I willing to do that work to remove that dependency so that my application doesn't need any system file to be modified for it to run? If I'm willing to do that work, then that means I'm willing to optimize it for the cloud. If I'm not willing to do that work, I just want to move it the way it is and just get it to the cloud any which way. Then I can do a lift and shift. If it's a lift and shift that I'm doing, is it containerized or is it non-containerized? If it's not containerized, is it a web application? If it's a web application, you'll probably want to use Azure App Service. Or you can, if it's not a web application, you can look to use something like virtual machine. If it's containerized, you go to, do you need orchestration capabilities? Azure Kubernetes Service. If it needs orchestration and if it doesn't need orchestration and if it's a web application, Azure App Service, and then essentially you can see sort of like the whole chain, the different decisions that we have to look at to come to a conclusion.
So at which part of this sort of like path will you use a dedicated host on the Azure environment?
Very, very good question, Sakofi. So dedicated hosts. So dedicated host is mainly for two use cases, right? There are certain security and compliance requirements where you're required to have hardware isolation, right? So if your organization, you're running a particular application, so this is probably common for industries like banking, government, healthcare, where they have some regulation or some security requirement to have hardware isolation, dedicated hosts. You need to look at that. Another use case for dedicated host is if you're running certain application where the licensing is based on physical CPUs. Have you seen this kind of licensing model before, Sakofi? Where they will actually say, for our application, the way it's licensed is we're going to license it based on physical CPUs. So let me bring up from VMware. So VMware.
Actually, when you say VMware, that clicked my mind because I think I was trying to set up even a Hyper-V or I think VirtualBox. Actually, that was on AWS, and for that you need that bare metal hardware. You cannot actually deploy it on any virtual machine. You need that bare metal, and I believe bare metal will be dedicated as well.
Yeah. So actually, like dedicated is not bare metal. It's not bare metal. It's just isolated, right? So it's isolated hardware. So it's not as if they're really offering bare metal as a service. So, but it's sort of like isolated.
With Microsoft, did they offer that option, the bare metal?
So you can do that if you use like capabilities, like they have like the VMware service on Azure. Yeah. So they actually have a service that you can use to implement VMware on Azure. So that's going to be running on bare metal, right? But if you have a look at, let me bring this up very quickly. So Azure dedicated hosts. So one of the things that Microsoft are careful to call out, if you look at the FAQs for dedicated hosts, is that no, this is not using. Okay, yeah, let me bring this up so that you can share this with everyone. So you can see this FAQ, Sakofi. Is dedicated host a bare metal as a service solution? And if I expand that, the answer is no.
Oh, I see.
It provides a virtualized environment that's architected to run Azure VMs, right? But it gives you control and visibility over the underlying physical server. However, it's not a bare metal as a service offering. Right. So essentially, it's isolated enough to meet the requirement, the compliance requirement that you need to meet, but it's not as if they're giving you like complete control of like it's not as if like that. So it's just running in an isolated environment. Okay. So does that make sense, Kofi? So does that answer your question in terms of the use cases for that?
Thank you for that.
Yeah, no problems. And by the way, so keep the questions coming also, audience. So if you have any question at all on what we're discussing, feel free, absolutely feel free to let us know. And then we're going to take it from there. So Sakofi, what we're going to have a quick look at is let's start by looking at Azure Virtual Machines, because that's an important aspect of the objectives of the Azure Solutions Architect.
Vijay just want you to bring out the last slide. He just wants you a bit probably memorize it, but I think you screenshot to be better.
You can always rewind Vijay. You can always rewind.
Yeah, that's an option as well.
You can always rewind the video. That's fine.
Yeah,
but you have to memorize it. Exactly. Vijay is like, how do you try to memorize it? Exactly. I completely feel you there. I feel what you're saying. So let's have a quick look. So let's have a quick look at some of this, because you probably get some questions relating to VM series in Azure. And actually, I'll give you one of them right now, so to test your knowledge. And we're going to look at some information about Azure VM generation support so that you have an understanding of what we're talking about. So let me quickly go bring up a question for you. So here's another question for you, ladies and gentlemen. It's always good. Always a good thing, Sakofi, I realize, to test your knowledge. I'll tell you a story, a recent story, Sakofi. So, I do Azure every single day. Every day.
You drink Azure, you sleep Azure.
but because of love, like the way I work and the stuff that I do and all the community activity that, Sakofi and myself do and everything, I do Azure every day. But then, about a few weeks ago, it was getting a bit stale, right? I was like, I was like reading things that I already knew again. I was like, I need something new, right? To feed the passion, I need something new. And what helped me to get going, Sakofi, was I went and I started taking test questions on Azure certifications that I already passed, right? And I started taking test questions. And guess what? All of a sudden, they were throwing questions that I was like, I didn't know you could do that. I was like, oh, that's interesting. What this question is asking me something I did not know that I could do that. So I went back, and before I knew it, I was so excited. I was busy hunting down different documents in Azure to understand how certain things work. So that's what questions does for us. Questions challenge our knowledge, and it drives our passion. So anyways, here's a question for you, ladies and gentlemen. So you plan to deploy a network-intensive application to several Azure virtual machines. You need to recommend a solution that meets the following requirements. You want to minimize the use of virtual machine processors to transfer data. You want to minimize network latency. Which virtual machine size and feature should you use? Remember that more than one answer may meet the requirement, but you pick the one that you think is best. So pick a virtual machine size that will help you to meet the requirement, and a virtual machine feature that will help you to meet the requirement. So you have, let's bring this up. You have 1 minute. Sorry, I'll drag this away from the screen and I'll start it. So you have 1 minute that I'm counting now. So let me know what you think the answer is. Which virtual machine size and feature are you going to use? Yeah, Sakofi, that was like a very interesting one. So yeah, I didn't buy like the dip also. I didn't have money to buy the dip. I was, I was
There's
like,
it's a cycle. It's definitely going to happen again.
that's why the people that have capital,
Exactly.
this world is so crazy. The people that have capital, we,
Yeah.
oh, it's so crazy. But all I know is that people they've taught me since I was young. They said, associate with the rich and you'll be rich. So I'm associated with Sakofi now. So eventually some of that richness is going to rub off. So
Yeah, don't worry. You have your good fun anytime. No, very, very soon.
yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to. Okay, the 1 minute is over now, ladies and gentlemen. So, any answers from anyone? No one is attempting this one. This is interesting. Just be aware that these are the sort of questions that you're going to be getting in your exam. So, you've got to be ready for this sort of questions. That's why we are doing this study series to help you to improve your knowledge. So,
Yes.
let's look at the requirement for this. So, the requirement says always, whenever you're answering the question in the exam, make sure you understand the requirement and the constraint properly, right? So let's have a look at the first requirement here. It says we want to minimize the use of virtual machine processors to transfer data, and we want to minimize network latency. So that looks to be the requirement that they're talking about. However, there's a requirement here that we should not miss. The requirement says you're deploying a network intensive application. So that is requirement number one right there. It's hidden in the question, but that's the first requirement. And this is requirement number two. So the reason for that is Microsoft have recommendations when it comes to the architect series on different types of applications and the type of different series of virtual machines and the type of workloads that they are optimized for. So for example, if I go to show you one very quickly, Sir Kofi, if I go to Azure VM sizes, so let me bring this up very quickly, Sir Kofi. So virtual machine sizes in Azure. And if you go to have a look at the way that Microsoft has added this to the document, you see that they're giving you a description of what the different series are for. So this one for small to medium databases, for low to medium traffic web servers. If you look at compute optimized, it's talking about it as a high CPU to memory ratio. Said it's good for traffic web servers, network appliances. Another way to put that is network intensive application, right? Batch processes. You see that there is no other VM series where Microsoft really, really calls out network intensiveness. So there's network latency when it comes to this one, high throughput network interfaces. However, when it comes to intensiveness, so it's compute optimized. So if we go back to the question, because it's network intensive application, I'll probably go for compute optimized in this case. Now, to the other requirement. The other requirement says we want to minimize the use of virtual machine processor to transfer data. We want to minimize network latency. Which of these Azure virtual machine feature helps us to achieve both of that? To understand that, I'm going to take you to another slide. So I'm going to take you to another slide, and then that will help you to understand the answer to this particular question. So there is a capability for Azure virtual machines called accelerated networking. What accelerated networking does, Kofi, is that it helps us to minimize network latency, network jitters for our application. Now, a standard Azure virtual machine without accelerated networking, here is the network process that's going on, right? So you have your application running on the virtual machine. The network flow goes through the application kernel, the operating system kernel, right? So if you know that Linux is going through the Linux kernel, so the kernel is actually doing the processing of network traffic. Then it goes to the virtual switch of the hypervisor. And the virtual switch of the hypervisor, that's where the policies are going to be implemented. So policies like your network security group and other policies that you've applied are going to be implemented at as the hypervisor virtual switch level, right? So, but what all of this is doing is that number one, this is introducing latency, right? Because it's doing this process in software. Because this is
Yeah.
also being processed in the kernel, it also gives room for interrupts, right? For CPU interrupts. And interrupts cause jitter. So that could, it's not saying it's going to, but it could be a cause where you may get some jitters if you have a network intensive application, or you get latency also. So what accelerated networking does, Sakofi, is that it's going to enable a capability called single root IO virtualization, SRIOV. And what that does is that it's going to skip essentially all of this. Plus, what it's also going to do is that it's going to allow the communication flow from your application to bypass the kernel, right? So essentially, it's flowing directly in hardware. So a lot of the processes that were the policies that have been applied in software over here will be applied at the hardware level, right? So rather than at software. And the benefit of that is that that's going to help to reduce latency. It's going to help to reduce jitter, right? And it's going to help to reduce CPU utilization because a lot of the kernel processing where it's using CPU, that's not taking place anymore.
All right.
So having this understanding now, let's go back to the question and let's see if we can answer the question. So let's go back to our question and let's see which feature do we think is going to help us to achieve this? What do you think, Psychophy?
It's right there.
It's
Single
right
root IO
there.
virtualization.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we have SRIOV. So that's why it's very important. Because when I see questions like this, Sakofi, you know what I do? I want to find out about all these features.
That's
So I
right.
go to go research about what receive side scaling. So we're not going to go into that today, but receive side scaling is something that can also help you. So receive side scaling can help you to um, minimize network latency. You can enable it from the operating system. However, it doesn't really help you with this other requirement, right? So you're minimizing the use of virtual machine processor because it's still going to be using virtual machine processor, but it can help you to minimize latency. So you can enable it using PowerShell on your Windows virtual machine and other stuff. So how DMA is not really helping you for network processing, same as virtual machine multi-queue. But you have to understand what these different features are in order for you to be able to pick the right service for the requirements that you're going to be given in your exams. So we're talking about SRIOV just now. So any consideration, anything that we need to pay attention to as architects in terms of limitations on use cases for SRIOV. Let's go have a look at some of the things that we need to pay attention to if we're looking to use this capability. So let's go have a quick look at that. So here's some things to watch out for. Number one, if you're going to be using accelerated networking, which is what enables SRIOV for Azure virtual machines, if you're going to be doing that, you have to know that number one, it's not supported for every operating system. So the reason why it's not supported for every operating system is because there's a software aspect to that where it's going to need certain drivers to be installed on the operating system, and then you have to enable it from the Azure platform also. So there's two sides to it. So it's only supported on Windows Server 2012 out or later, Ubuntu 16, or essentially any modern operating system is going to support it, right? So if the different virtual machine sizes that you're using has to support accelerated networking. Not all virtual machine sizes in Azure support accelerated networking. A series is the most basic series of virtual machine in Azure. It's very low cost, right? However, it's also missing capabilities accelerated networking. So if you go to have a look at the documents that I shared with you just now, if you have a look at this document and you have a look at the basic level, which is the E series, so let's go to the AV2 series. So they are the entry level virtual machine in Azure for entry level workloads. You see that they do not support accelerated networking, right? but they're very, very low cost. So, so they're just basic. You use them for dev and test, not something that you use for production. So they don't support that. So be aware of that in case you get in your exam where you get something about A series and accelerated networking. A series doesn't support that. So the sizes for the others that support it. So if the size is a general purpose size, any size that has 2 CPUs or more support it. If the size supports hyperthreading, then any size that has 4 CPUs or more is going to support that. Can you enable accelerated networking on a virtual machine that's running? The answer to that is no. You have to stop the virtual machine. You have to deallocate it before you can enable accelerated networking. Again, it's going to have to, again, put it on the right hardware in Azure, so it has to be stopped and deallocated. If you're building your own image that you're bringing into Azure, there are certain drivers that you need to install on that custom image for accelerated networking to work. So you're going to need these drivers to be installed on your custom image. And then finally, so this one is a very important one, Sir Kofi, because now that we've heard about accelerated networking, we're like, oh, I'm just going to enable accelerated networking for every single virtual machine that I have in Azure so I can get the best performance. So as architects, one of the things that we have to understand is understand what the impact of certain features are. Will accelerated networking help me if my virtual machine is having communication with a server on the internet? Probably not. Probably not, right? So because it's sort of like the weakest chain, Kofi, right? So you
Yeah.
have accelerated networking to your hypervisor, right? So that's bypassing all the Hyper-V switch and that's going straight into the physical switch in Azure. However, as you know, accelerated networking is not going to help you for the latency all the way to the internet, right?
Yeah.
It's not going to help you. You probably have a lot of that in your work, Kofi, where people call in and people go, "Oh, my network is is not performing very well. I think it's your software. I think it's your network appliance that's slowing down my network."
Yeah, we get that all the time.
And you're probably like, "There's so many places where
Yeah,
delay could come in, right?"
exactly.
So that. So what this one can help you with is that accelerated networking is good if you have virtual machines that are communicating with each other that are connected to the same virtual network. That's where you're going to get the best result, right? So in a scenario like the one that we have earlier, so if I go back to the other slide, in a scenario like this, let's go. We'll come back to that one. So, what am I doing? Sorry. Let's go back. I'll come back. I've missed the slide. And let's go back to this. So, in this sort of scenario, Kofi, where you have maybe these two virtual machines are connected to the same virtual network, they will highly benefit from accelerated networking in that case. Okay, so I'm looking at the time and time is running out. So, let's look at some other topics that we need to know.
Yeah, just a quick one before we move away from this one. Got Opemi asking a question: what is the state of security in Azure VM accelerated networking?
Oh, you want to mean by the state of security? I'm trying to understand that question. The state of security. So it's not. So the same network communication is what is going on with accelerated networking. All it's doing is that it's bypassing the operating system kernel and it's bypassing the hypervisor switch. Okay. Maybe I'm trying to get your question. Maybe what OPM is asking is that maybe because I said that the policies are applied on the virtual switch level. Does that mean that if we skip the virtual switch, does that mean that the policies will not be applied? So if that's what you're asking, that's a very good question, Okoyemi. And let me bring up this document to help you to answer that. So accelerated networking, let's bring up this document that will help you to answer that. So it doesn't skip policies. All it's doing is skipping the switch. So it's still going to apply the policy. So if you have a look, it says, if you have a look at the document, it says, without accelerated networking, all network traffic in and out of the VM transverse the host and the virtual switch, right? The virtual switch is where the policy is enforced, like network security group. However, because you're using accelerated networking, doesn't mean it's going to skip the policy. All the network policies are still going to be applied. However, they're going to be offloaded and applied in hardware. So it doesn't skip your security policies. It's still going to apply those security policies, only that it's going to apply them in hardware rather than in software, which is going to be relatively quicker. So hopefully that answers your question, Okoyemi. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so let's move on very quickly because I'm looking at we just have 10 minutes and I want to at least talk about some scaling and some security, and then we can stop for today. So, Sakofi, let's talk about scalability of virtual machines. See, Sakofi, one of the things that I've learned about, there's always a deeper level of knowledge, right? There's always a deeper level of knowledge when it comes to certain things. So we're going to look, I can say Akwasi is so excited about Azure.
Yeah.
Hold on, you go Akwasi. So let's look at some of the scalability considerations when we talk about virtual machines in Azure, because that's important for the exam we're going to be doing. So scalability, we want to monitor the vCPU quota for our virtual machines. So why is that important, right? So why do you think that's important, Sakofi? Like we need to monitor the vCPU quota when we talk about scalability.
Oh, so you want to monitor the virtual CPU quota?
Yeah. So, and I'm talking about when it comes to scalability and some of the considerations, one of the things that we want to put in place is we want to put in place monitoring for vCPU quota for Azure.
Yeah, because that could potentially be a bottleneck. So if the CPU obviously spiked to a certain level, then it will affect things that you process. So obviously, if you want to scale up to add more resources, that's the key. That's the area you have to consider.
Yeah, and that's exactly true, sir. So that's absolutely true. So because Azure subscriptions have limits, they have quotas. You can't exceed those quotas, right? There's some quotas that you can raise a Microsoft support tickets to increase. There's some quotas that you cannot increase. You may need to use a different subscription where you've not reached that quota limit. So when it comes to CPU quotas in Azure, it applied at two levels. There is a regional quota, which essentially says, for example, in UK South, you have 100 vCPUs, regardless of the VM size that you're using. You have 100 CPUs, right? So there's a regional level quota. There is also a VM service quota where Microsoft says, for this size of virtual machine, you have 100 CPU. So you have to look at monitoring your quota on those two levels. Because even if you do not reach the quota on the regional level, if you hit the quota for the VM service that you're trying to provision and deploy, that's still going to fail, right? So you have to put in monitoring for that when it comes to that. The other thing that you can also look at when it comes to scaling is that you can use a service in Azure called VM Scale Set to automate scaling in Azure. So let's quickly go have a look at VM Scale Set and let's have a look at some interesting information about this service. Now, what VM Scale Set does is it allows us to create and manage a set of load balanced virtual machines in Azure. So instead of me manually creating virtual machine and adding them to a load balancer, VM Scale Set takes this responsibility for me. So it's going to provide capabilities like auto scaling, right? So it's going to provide capabilities like checking the health of my virtual machines and automatically recovering them if there were to be a failure. So how VM Scale Set works is that we either provide VM Scale Set with a custom image that has our application, or we provide it with a marketplace virtual machine image, maybe with a virtual machine extension that you can use to automate our application deployment. So we provide any of these two as an input to VM Scale Set. In VM Scale Set, we configure the limits that we want. We specify a minimum instance number. We specify a maximum instance number. We specify the scale conditions. If this condition gets triggered, add one more instance. If this condition gets triggered, remove one instance. So we specify all of those in VM Scale Set, and VM Scale Set manages all of that for us. It's going to provision the load balancer. That could be an Azure standard load balancer. That could be an Azure application gateway. And then it's going to deploy identical virtual machines, and it's going to automatically provision them. And if the scale condition to increase is triggered, it's going to add more instances. And if the scale condition to decrease is triggered, it's going to remove the instances. So that is what virtual machine skill set provides to us. But what are the architectural considerations of this, Kofi? Let's go quickly have a look at some of the architectural considerations. Number one, what is the maximum number of virtual machines that we can deploy in an Azure virtual machine skill set? So put your answer in the chat windows, ladies and gentlemen. What is the maximum number of virtual machines that we can deploy in a virtual machine skill set in Azure at the moment? So what is the current number? So I'm looking at the chat window for any answers that may be coming through. Maximum number of virtual machines. I can see that coffee is just saying that. Is it a coffee? Wow. Well done, man. I can see your clothes. Oh, I can see 10. Wow. Many people look down on Azure. 10? 10. Wow. Okay, let's have a look and let's see. So the answer to that is 1,000. Wow. It's 1,000. So I can see Manu says 100 instances. So you're also right, Manu. So it depends on the condition. So here's the condition. If you're using a marketplace image, an image from the Azure Marketplace, and you're using managed disk, which is where Microsoft manages the VM disk for you or the storage account of the VM disk, you can have up to 1,000 virtual machines in a skill set. If you're using your own custom image, that you've built a custom image yourself and you're using managed disk, you can have up to 600 virtual machines in a skill set. If you're using, so to Manu's answer now, if you're using a marketplace image and you're using unmanaged disk that's managed by you, not by Microsoft, you can go up to 100 virtual machines in a skill set. And if you're using a custom image with unmanaged disk, you can go up to 20. So essentially, you get the maximum number have marketplace images with managed disk. That gives you up to 1,000. Custom image with managed disk, that gives you up to 600. Azure Virtual Machine skill set also supports uniform or flexible orchestration mode. Now, this one is a new one, Sarkofi. This is something that's new, right? This is something that's brand new, created by Microsoft. What does this mean? Let me show you what I mean, Sarkofi. Let me go to the Azure portal very quickly. So, portal.azure.com. And in the Azure portal, I'm going to try to create a virtual machine skill set. And I think that's probably where we'll stop today, sadly. But let me go ahead and show that to you. So that's a new one. So you're going to learn something new that Microsoft just came out with. So let me go to create a new virtual machine skill set. So let's go to virtual machine skill set over here. And if I go to create, when I'm creating a virtual machine skill set, it's going to give me a new option now. And the option that it's going to give to me is to say, which orchestration mode do you want to use, David? Do you want to use, you can see it right here. Do you want to use uniform orchestration mode or flexible orchestration mode? And you can see that flexible mode is in preview. So what is the difference between uniform and flexible orchestration mode? Why did Microsoft even bring in flexible orchestration mode? Let me quickly go through that and then we'll stop there today. So this is really talking about homogeneous versus heterogeneous virtual machines. What does that mean, David? That's a lot of, complex English, right? that you're using. What that means is that homogeneous means identical virtual machines. Heterogeneous means non-identical virtual machines. Now the word uniform all of a sudden makes sense to you.
Yeah,
because uniform means the virtual machines that you're deploying in this skill set have to be identical, right? So a good example of that is the operating system of the virtual machines in uniform mode, which is homogeneous, has to be either all Windows or all Linux. The virtual machine sizes needs to be the same. The virtual machine instance type needs to be the same. So in Azure, there is an instance type called Spot Instances that allows us to deploy unused capacity in Azure. So we can purchase unused capacity in Azure with Spot Instances. If you're using uniform orchestration mode, you can either have all your instances being Spot instances or all your instances being regular instances. You cannot have a mix of Spot instances and regular instances. The new flexible mode allows you to have a mix of Spot instances and regular instances, right? So that's why they call it flexible, right? It allows you to be a bit more flexible. So also, the uniform mode gives limited operating system control, while the new flexible orchestration mode is going to give us full operating system control. The reason for this is because many will may not realize, but the previous mode of virtual machine skill set actually does an abstraction where it does not give us full control of the underlying operating system. Even though you can RDP into it, you can SSH into it, you don't have full control. Whereas with the new model is going to be using just typical Azure virtual machines, which means we have full control of the underlying operating system. And this is another one that many people may not realize, and this is where I'll stop today, Sir Kofi. So many people may not realize that if you're using the previous virtual machine skill set mode, which is the uniform mode, you have an high availability SLA limit. If you're deploying your virtual machine instances within a single zone, you should not have more than 100 instances in that skill set. If you have more than 100 instances, you have no high availability SLA. Now, many people don't know that. Those are the kind of things that we have to know as architects, right? Because that's how we make our decisions. So, for example, let me show you this mode very quickly. And I'll show you that information that I just shared with you, and I'll stop there. So let me show you that mode very quickly. So this document, which I'll also put in the chat window for you to have a look at, goes into a lot of details on the difference between uniform mode and flexible mode for virtual machine skill set. But one of the things you see with uniform mode here, Sir Kofi, is that uniform orchestration provides fault domain high availability guarantees when configured with fewer than 100 instances. Now, many people may not notice that, but that's the truth. So many people have been deploying more than 100 instances, and what they don't know is that they lose their SLA at that point. But with the flexible orchestration mode, it actually allows you to have up to 1,000 virtual machine without losing your high availability guarantee, which is the SLA, right? So it actually helps you to bypass a lot of that. So this goes into a lot of detail, so you can go into that document. So I'll put this document in the chat window, but that will help you to understand the differences in the virtual machine skill set modes that we have, flexible or uniform.
Thank you for sharing.
Sir Kofi, there's a lot more things that we need to talk about, but that's where we're going to pick it up from next week. So we've looked at scalability, we've looked at some performance, we still need to look at security, and or in terms of virtual machines. So, and that's where we stop. So we look at security, and then we're going to move to the next exam objective. So that's where we'll stop today, Sir Kofi. So what do we have for the people before we go?
All right, thank you guys, and thank you, Sir David, for this wonderful walkthrough. I told you guys that today, it's worth the wait. Thank you again for joining the session, and I hope we will see you guys next week as well. So, Sir David, I believe this is the part one, and next week we're going to continue with the same Azure IaaS. Is that correct?
Yeah. So what we're going to try to do is, I've been thinking about this, but we may have to adjust our timing. So what I'll do is that we can just complete we just quickly cover the last part of the objective so that we can move quickly to cover the rest of the objective. So we're not going to have a full part two. We're just going to have the conclusion of the aspect that we need to cover for the exam.
Yeah.
And then we'll move on. The next topic we'll be looking at the platform compute services, right? And then after that, we'll move to the container compute services. And then we'll move through the other objectives very quickly also.
That's right. So once again, thank you very much for joining, and we will see you guys next week.
There's
Have
a question
wonderful...
actually. I saw. Sorry,
Oh,
apologies.
you saw a question? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, my apologies.
So,
I missed that one. Yeah.
no problems. So
Okay,
let me help Okoyemi to answer the question. So Okoyemi says, does your subscription determine the orchestration mode? Because mine is just allowing me to choose the uniform mode while the flexible is graded out. So that's true, Okoyemi, because the flexible mode is currently in public preview. So
Yeah.
it's going to go from public preview. So the documents that I put in the chat window is going to walk you through what you need to enable that if you want to start testing that out. So what you need to do to register for it is you need to go to your subscription and you need to enable these preview features for VM Orchestrator single FD and VM Orchestrator multi FD. So once you enable those features, it's going to allow you to begin to play around with the new flexible mode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it looks like the feature registration will take up to 15 minutes. So if it doesn't show up, you have to wait 15 minutes. Right.
Good point, Sakofi. Good point.
All right, guys. So thank you again, and we will see you guys next week. Have a wonderful evening and morning, afternoon, wherever it is.
Yeah.
All right, bye.